Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be introducing the endocrine system, and as we do, I'd like to just sort of recap a couple of important details from previous lectures. The first is that we have to, of course, remember that homeostasis is necessary in order to prevent disease and even possible death if the derangement is severe. And the endocrine system is very much focused on maintaining homeostasis. And secondly, one of the other critical underlying principles of physiology is cell-to-cell communication being necessary in order for the cells to be able to survive with each other. And so we're going to sort of compare and contrast a little bit the nervous system. And if you remember, the nervous system was basically responsible for very short-term, rapid communication via synaptic transmission. And the endocrine system, in contrast, is more focused on long-term cellular communication. So the endocrine system, we're talking about minutes, hours, days, and in some cases years in terms of the hormonal influence over the body, as compared to the nervous system where we're talking more about milliseconds or seconds. So let's just draw a couple similarities quickly, and then we're going to spend a lot of time actually contrasting them. But it's important to note that because of these similarities, the endocrine system is sort of like the other leg of control over cell communication in the body. So it kind of works very closely with the nervous system, even though its functionality is a little different. So a couple important similarities. One, both systems rely on the release of chemicals that bind to receptors. Differences would be, where those receptors are specifically located and how the chemicals get there. Second similarity is they both have similar chemical messengers. So, for example, epinephrine and norepinephrine are considered neurotransmitters, and they're also considered hormones. You probably would consider norepinephrine a little bit more of a neurotransmitter and epinephrine a little bit more of a hormone, but technically there is some crossover, and they are performing very similar functions, in some cases binding to the same receptors. Both systems require negative feedback control, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the endocrine system's negative feedback because it actually is quite intricate in some cases. And then lastly, they use all of these components to regulate other cells, tissues, and organs for the purpose of maintaining homeostasis. So those are some important similarities. I think we're going to kind of spend the rest of the time with the endocrine system contrasting them. But it's important to remember that they're closely linked as we progress through the rest of the material. So let's talk about just some important terminology in order to prepare us appropriately for talking about the endocrine system. So endocrine cells are glandular secretory cells that release their secretions into extracellular fluid. So keeping in mind that extracellular fluid is both the interstitial fluid and the intravascular fluid, basically what we're saying is that these cells are going to release chemicals into the ECF, and ultimately they may just travel a little bit around in the ECF, or most cases that we're going to discuss, they're actually going to travel in the bloodstream a little bit further away. So let's just contrast this word with exocrine cells. So exocrine cells, although we may not have used the terminology before, we've discussed them before in the context of certain things like goblet cells in the respiratory tract would be an example of an exocrine cell. So these cells release their secretions onto epithelial surfaces. So this is a critical difference, basically, is where the chemicals are going, where the secretions are going, whether it's into the ECF for travel or onto the epithelial surface for the purpose of lubrication for various reasons. Now, there are a couple of important types of communication that can occur sort of in conjunction with the endocrine system, and I'm placing them here in order of how much we're going to discuss them, least to most. So, but I do want to just introduce these first couple, autocrine and paracrine, just for the purpose of familiarity when the examples do in fact arise. So, autocrine communication, we're just going to draw sort of a little representation here. Basically, a particular cell will release a chemical into the ECF immediately surrounding it, and that chemical will actually sort of circle back and bind to a receptor or interact with that particular cell. So basically affects itself. So auto often refers to oneself. And so these chemicals may affect that particular cell where they come from, or they may affect cells that are the same type of cell. And this is referred to as autocrine communication. The next example is paracrine communication. In paracrine communication, we're talking about one cell that releases chemicals that will be diffusing into the ECF and then will affect other cells that are very nearby. So these chemicals are going to affect adjacent cells. That would be paracrine communication. And then lastly, and this was going to be the primary focus of our lecture, so we're going to spend almost all of the time talking about endocrine communication. We have endocrine cells that release chemicals, and basically those chemicals are going to affect distant tissues. And what essentially we mean by that is we're not talking about cells that are right next to the cell where the secretion is coming from, but rather the hormones have to hop into the bloodstream, and they're going to basically take the superhighway to wherever it is that their intended destination is. And those cells that they're going to affect may be different organs, different body systems, any variety. So for the purpose of clarity, the chemicals that we're talking about, particularly when they're affecting distant tissues, but even many times, I think, even if we're talking about autocrine or paracrine, those chemicals are called hormones. So in the same way that we use the word ligand before to sort of interchangeably describe a chemical, in the context of the endocrine system, we're talking about chemicals that are going to travel in the bloodstream. We're talking about hormones, and it's just another word to describe what we're referring to. Okay, so the last thing I want to do to sort of introduce the endocrine system and get ready for talking about it is talk about all the different organs and glands where there is in fact endocrine function. And it's important to note that some of the organs are specifically endocrine organs, and that is their primary role. But there are many other organs that we've talked about that really belong to other body systems, but those they actually have either some type of endocrine control that's happening or some particular piece of endocrine function, and so therefore we're going to actually end up talking about a lot of body systems that aren't technically endocrine. So let's take a look at our little friend here. So we're going to draw the brain, and in the brain we have the hypothalamus, which we know is part of the diencephalon, and then we also have something that we haven't mentioned before, I don't think, which is the pituitary gland. We're actually going to refer to it as the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary because the two segments have independent hormones that they release. And these, we'll have to take a look at some photographs in order to get a better understanding, but just if you could remember for now that they're in the brain, that would be excellent. And the pineal gland is also located in the brain. We're really not going to mention it too much, but it is truly an endocrine organ, so I just want to mention that it belongs there. Next, we have the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is located anterior to the trachea, just actually inferior to the cricoid cartilage. And it looks kind of like a butterfly almost as it wraps around the trachea. And you can't see based on this picture, but the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland has 4 additional glands, and those are the parathyroid glands. And again, we'll have to look at some textbook pictures in order to see the parathyroid glands, but there's 4, 2 on each side, posterior to the thyroid gland. In the chest cavity, we have the heart. The heart actually has there's some endocrine control that's exerted over the heart. And very interestingly, even some of the things that ultimately can go wrong with the heart can be a result of an endocrine derangement. So it's very, very important that we discuss that moving forward. We also have the thymus, which is a minor endocrine function. Also not going to be a major focus of our lecture, but we'll mention it. The kidneys have some endocrine control and function. And right on top of the kidneys, another true endocrine organ is the adrenal glands. So and kidneys also could be are referred to as renal. And so if you think of adrenal, we're talking about basically just right on top of renal, and that would be the way to remember. So both the kidneys and the adrenal glands are retroperitoneal. Also, we have the pancreas. The pancreas is only about 1% endocrine function and about 99% digestive or GI function. So the endocrine cells of the pancreas are called the islets of Langerhans, and the pancreas also is retroperitoneal, of course. So we'll be mentioning that. This picture not so clear if it's a male or a female. So if it was a female, we would see that the ovaries are the endocrine glands, and if it was a male, then we would say the testes are the endocrine glands. And then lastly, there is the digestive tract, and I'm just drawing basically the intestines here, but in the digestive tract, including the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine, and then some of the accessory organs like the liver, and of course the pancreas, they all have some interaction with many GI hormones. So we'll mostly focus on that in the digestive system, but it is important to note that there is endocrine control there as well. Okay, so that wraps up our introduction to the endocrine system, and moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit about the different ways in which the endocrine system is regulated, how the hormones actually work, and then we'll talk specifically about the different organs and endocrine pathways. Thanks for watching.